Hi friends, I'm Colleen Dieter, landscape consultant, certified arborist, and founder of atxgardens.com. Welcome to the ATX Gardens podcast, where every other week I share simple, timely tips to help your garden thrive. Whether you're a seasoned green thumb or just getting started, you'll learn exactly what to do in your Central Texas garden right now. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and find even more gardening resources at atxgardens.com. Hey there, gardener friends. Thanks for joining me today for episode 5 of the ATX Gardens podcast, airing on November 13th, 2025. I'm Colleen Dieter, a landscape consultant at atxgardens.com. Today's episode is all about what to do in the second half of November in your gardens and landscapes in Austin, Texas. But before we get to our gardening to-do list, this episode is sponsored by my landscape consulting business, atxgardens.com. I help my customers by alleviating their anxieties about their yards. This week, I met with Jody, a repeat customer who had a house in South Austin where I helped her back in 2020. And then she moved out to Bastrop and got a new home out there, and she had me come out to consult out there too. And she has a very large lot in Bastrop, and she wants to turn it into a food forest. A food forest is a low-maintenance, edible landscape that's designed to mimic a natural forest by layering lots of different food-producing plants, starting with the tall shade trees, then the smaller fruit trees and understory trees, and then down to ground covers and edible, useful plants, mostly perennials. And I gave her some advice about how to get started building a food forest and what plants to situate in which part of her property, and explained how to lay out the yard with walkways to get from place to place. So if you have questions like that, if you're curious about food forests or changing even just a small section of your yard, make an appointment with me today at atxgardens.com. All right, let's get to the show. Okay, mid and late November is when everything changes dramatically in our gardens and landscapes, more so than other parts of the year. This is when the warm season plants are really wrapping up their bloom time and the plants start getting ready for winter. In Austin, the average first freeze is around November 30th into the first few days of December. A lot of suburban and exurban places, especially in low-lying valleys, in low spaces, they're going to get freezes earlier than that. So this is the time when we start to see our first freezes around this area. A lot of the content in today's episode of this podcast is about this transitional time from fall to winter in our landscapes. And we didn't get much of a fall this year, but it's still happening. Winter is coming. So if you have cold-sensitive tropical plants or cold-sensitive succulents, make a plan for moving them indoors or protecting them from the cold. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the fruit tree section of this episode, so keep listening. And November is a really great time to start a new compost pile, and I'm going to be doing that at my house. It's a good time because there's plenty of tree leaves available to use as a base for a compost pile. And compost is basically stuff that used to be alive, but it has been broken down into its more basic parts and decomposed. And it's filled with microorganisms that inoculate the soil and help feed your plants. And it also has some nutrients in it, a lot of complex micronutrients and things like that that the plants need too to feed the plants right away. It's a very gentle feeding. You can apply compost to any plant almost any time of the year. It's okay. If you're going to start a compost pile, I recommend starting with a pile that's at least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. The number one mistake that folks make is they make their compost piles too small and then they don't work properly. You have to have a lot of material. And that pile should be 2/3 tree leaves and then 1/3 kitchen scraps. And the kitchen scraps should be anything that's not meat or dairy that can decompose. So think about apple cores, eggshells, tea bags, coffee grounds, even paper towels, lint from your lint trap, dog hair, cat hair, pet hair, your own hair. Hair has a lot of nitrogen in it and is really good for the compost pile. So I recommend it. Try to keep it super simple. You can really overcomplicate a compost pile and it doesn't need to be complicated. Just do the best you can. Make it as big as you can. If you have a dog or you have other animals in your area, like raccoons, that will get into the compost pile, you may want to have a compost bin or a tumbler instead, but it needs to be really big. Most of the tumblers out there are too small. So you need to have a bin or a tumbler that's really big, at least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot to really work properly and to keep those critters from eating your food scraps. For many years, I had a compost pile and I never had any problems with the animals eating the food scraps. I mean, probably for over 10 years, I had a really good pile. I just buried the food scraps really deeply in the pile and never had any problems. And then all of a sudden, the raccoons discovered it and they started eating all the food scraps and it wasn't working anymore. It wasn't decomposing properly. So I got some really big tumblers and that helps. Now they're working really well. I'll talk more about compost in future episodes too. That's just a quick intro. Try to keep it as simple as possible. What's going on with our woody plants at this time of year in the garden? November is a really good time to plant and transplant woody plants. So that's all the trees, shrubs, roses, and woody vines. Planting them now while they're going dormant, they're slowing down, they're going to stop growing. Some of them are going to lose their leaves here. They're losing their leaves. It's a really good time to plant them now, and they can start getting established before the summer heat sets in. Possum haw holly and yaupon hollies are some of my favorites for winter interest because their berries are turning red now, and they have red berries all winter. They're really beautiful. I recommend always lining them up with a window in your house so you can look out the window and see that beautiful little tree with its berries. So, what's going on with our fruit trees here in Central Texas in the second half of November? Rake up and remove your fruit tree leaves as they fall on the ground if possible. That helps prevent diseases and pests from reinfecting your trees next spring. But don't make yourself nuts. You don't have to pick up every single last leaf, but do the best you can. Enjoy the fall color on your fruit trees if they're still holding on to some leaves. I love the fall color on the fruit trees. Now is a good time to plant containerized fruit trees, and that includes apples, pears, peaches, plums. The palm trees, POM, are the trees that have the fruits that have cores, like apples and pears, and stone fruits are the fruits that have pits, like cherries, plums, nectarines, and peaches. Cherries generally don't grow here, but I really am suspicious and wondering if anyone has tried and been successful, but generally they don't grow here. This is a good time for planting persimmons and grapes in containers if you can find them. Sometimes the fruit trees can be hard to find at this time of year. Later in December and January, I'll talk more about fruit tree planting because there's more availability at that time of the year. Okay, now get ready to protect your citrus trees from freezing temperatures. If you have them in a pot, be prepared to bring the pot indoors or into a sheltered area like a porch or a garage up near a building where it's warmer. If they freeze, freezing weather will kill most citrus. If your pot that you have your citrus in is very big and heavy, consider moving it with a hand truck or a dolly. And consider keeping them in plastic pots to make them lighter. I have a big key lime tree, and at this time of year, I get the dolly out and I use ratchet straps and I just strap the lime tree to the dolly. And then when the freezing weather comes, my husband moves it into the garage for me to, to protect it from cold. If you can't move the pot because of size and weight, or your citrus trees are in the ground, be prepared. You'll want to water them really well before the freeze, and then cover them with floating row fabric, which is lightweight white fabric, or old sheets or blankets. Do not use plastic like a vinyl shower curtain or greenhouse plastic to cover plants because if it touches the plant, it actually makes the leaves colder and freezes them. If you have a little greenhouse, start moving everybody in there and getting them ready. If the plant is in the ground and it's really small, you can fill a trash can with leaves and turn it over on top of the tree to insulate it from the cold, or pile up straw or hay bales around the tree. But you have to remove those things after the freeze so that the plant can get light. So don't forget, if you're using fabric that is opaque like a blanket and no light is coming through, you have to remove it after the freeze. Do not use heat lamps or space heaters that can burn plants and can be a fire hazard, and I have seen that happen before. Old-fashioned incandescent holiday lights strung onto the branches of citrus trees are both warming for the tree and quite festive. Just use them safely and keep fabric and other flammable stuff away from them. LED lights do not get warm enough to warm your plants at all. So I personally always keep my citrus and any tender succulents that I have in pots so I can bring them inside during a freeze and not mess around with covering them because the covering is just really hard. Usually when the freezes come, they come along with very strong north winds. And if you just got home from work and you just found out that there's going to be a freeze and it's getting dark outside and there's 15-mile-an-hour winds or more, and you're trying to cover a plant, it is no fun. And you're more likely to do more harm than good by breaking a bunch of branches on the tree or squishing the plant with covers. And trying to weigh the covers down is really hard if it's really windy. So just be prepared, figure out your strategy if there's a plant that you really care about, and reserve this kind of activity for the plants that you really, really care about, and try to limit the number of cold sensitive plants that you care for. And that will help make gardening a lot more fun. Citrus trees are usually producing fruit or just got done producing fruit at this time of year, and they appreciate some gentle feeding if they're in pots. If you're growing citrus in pots, a little bit of liquid humate, some seaweed, and some dry organic granular fertilizer is good for them, for the citrus in pots. If they're in the ground, just seaweed and a little bit of liquid humate are good for them at this time of the year. Now it's time for our sponsor break. Hi, y'all. I'm Colleen Dieter with atxgardens.com. You know, I give plenty of garden advice on my podcast, but there's nothing like meeting in person to get the best information for your plants and landscape. That's what I can do for you. Visit atxgardens.com. As a certified arborist and professional gardener, I've been giving advice to do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. I help my customers by alleviating their anxieties about their yards. Visit atxgardens.com to book a consultation with me. During your consultation, we'll walk through your yard together and answer all of your questions. Also at atxgardens.com, you can shop Colleen's favorite things. That's gardening apparel, tools, and books that I often mention during the podcast. From trees to vegetables to wildflowers, I'm here to help. Make an appointment at atxgardens.com. Now back to the show. I'm delighted because I got some listener mail, so I'm going to read it to you here. I've been enjoying your advice since I attended your class at the Wildflower Center a while back, and especially have found your maintenance zines so helpful. Thank you. I'm religiously listening to your new podcast. Thanks for the timely info. Question. I have redone much of our large lawn with mostly native plants and hardscaping/stone/mulch as well. I just completed my Hell Strip lawn conversion, which I am so thrilled with, and used mostly free plants from other parts of my yard that I dug up. And I'm wondering if I need to give all those new and newly transplanted plants once a week watering for a full year starting now? Or do they go dormant after it freezes? Best, Lynn. And Lynn told me that she planted Zexmenia, rock rose, native lantana, autumn sage, little blue stem, red yucca, pyramid plant, Gulf muley, and Pride of Barbados. And so basically she's asking me, after she just recently transplanted and planted all these new plants, how much water do they need? How often? And really, I think if it doesn't rain, the rain makes a huge difference. For the first couple of weeks after they're in the ground, you really need to check them every few days, and you don't want the water, or you don't want the soil to dry out. It should remain moist like a wrung out sponge. So that might mean watering once every 5 days, depending on if it's windy, depending on if it's a hot area, if it's been cool outside. You know, in a hell strip area, which is the name for the space between the sidewalk and the street, that can be very, very hot and very exposed, even in the winter. If there's a lot of sun, it can dry out pretty fast. But the other factor that you're thinking about when you're figuring out how often to water stuff is also the quality of the soil and how much moisture the soil holds over time. And a hell strip area can really go either way. Sometimes the soil is really, really compacted and very heavy clay up by the street. And sometimes there's some caliche in there that can hold water for a really long time. So you just have to check it and see what it's like. Sometimes, if the sidewalk has been put in recently and there's like chunks of concrete and rocks and sand that was used as a base layer for a sidewalk, and sometimes the soil can dry out really fast up by the street. So you really have to use your finger, move your mulch out of the way, and try to put your finger in the soil to feel it, to see how moist or dry it is. And that can be really tricky, especially in the winter as the weather starts cooling off. It can be really hard to tell if your finger is actually moist or if it's just cold outside. So I recommend using a moisture meter too if you get confused. And we're going to have a link in the show notes to a moisture meter that I recommend that you can get on Amazon. They're easy to use, they're inexpensive. They're not particularly durable items. I've definitely bent moisture meters and broken them getting them into the ground. But, try to be gentle when you use them if you have really hard ground. Think about that. In general, after a few weeks, you'll still want to continue watering those new perennials about once a week. And you'll want to water them really deeply unless it rains. And after a couple of months of watering them like that, generally they're pretty well established and you can start backing off and letting them dry out between waterings a little bit. And it really varies from plant to plant and site to site of like how much water you're going to need and how often. And so it's a really hard question to answer, and there's no sort of one size fits all answer for you. It also depends on how you're watering, if you're using an irrigation system, if you're using soaker hoses or sprinklers on the end of the hose, and it just makes a big difference depending on your particular situation. So just check the soil. Try to keep it moist like a wrung out sponge for the first couple weeks. Don't let it dry out. And then after that, you can start backing off. But they still need water in the winter time, particularly the Gulf muley and the autumn sage and the rock rose, because they stop actively growing, but they still have leaves. And they're still all trying to get their roots established and everything like that. So it's a moving target, especially if it's cool and rainy. You won't need to water as much. Just keep looking at them. There's an old saying that the best fertilizer for the garden is the gardener's shadow. That just means the more time you spend out in the garden, the better your garden is going to be because you're monitoring the situation. So now, thank you so much, Lynn, for that great question. I really appreciate you listening. I appreciate you mentioning the maintenance zines. I have these booklets available on my website called Let's Care for Texas Plants. That's all about how to maintain the types of plants that Lynn was talking about, like Zexmenias, rock roses, autumn sage, the ornamental grasses, things like that are all included in there. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Now, what's going on with our perennials and bulbs? If you have perennials right now that you got from a friend or that you got from the nursery, get them in the ground as soon as possible and avoid getting any more. Planting at this time of year is risky. If you plant perennials and we get a really hard freeze, it can kill them and they won't grow back in the spring the way we expect them to. Do not divide or transplant perennials now. Wait until early spring. Okay. And keep listening to the podcast because I'll let you know when it's time. Cool season perennials, on the other hand, like yarrow, lyre-leaf sage, and columbines can be planted now. So just learn the life cycle of your perennials to find out when they actively grow, if they're cool season perennials or if they're warm season perennials. Cool season perennials can still be planted at the end of November. Certain types of bulbs can still be planted at the end of November too, like bearded irises, agapanthus, crinum lilies, iphions, rain lilies, and Dutch irises. You can still get those guys in the ground. They might not bloom this year. They might not bloom after planting. It might take them a couple of years before they start blooming. So make sure you make a durable label for them. I recommend rocks with paint pens. Use an acrylic or oil-based paint pen and draw the name of the plant onto the rocks. And we'll put a link in the show note to paint pens that I like too. Okay, now moving on to the vegetable garden. Late November is your last chance to plant cool season vegetables like radishes, turnips, beets, and carrots. And those plants should always be planted directly into the garden from seed because they're root crops. They do not transplant well. They have sensitive roots, so you really just need to put seeds directly in the ground. Cool season greens like chard, mustard, turnips, kale, collards, spinach, and lettuce can all be planted now either from seed or as little starter plants, aka transplants. Remember that keeping the soil moist and keeping your plants fully hydrated is the most important thing when you're preparing for freezing weather in the vegetable garden or really in any part of the landscape. The plants will be more resistant to freezing and cold weather if they are fully hydrated. So make sure to water them before cold weather comes on and make sure to use mulch. In the vegetable garden, I love using tree leaves or pine straw as mulch in the vegetable garden. I know vegetable gardeners are always asking me about covers and covering the plants. So I'm going to give you some advice about covering, but it's not as important as watering. So you can make hoops over your vegetable beds with pipes or wires, like a little Quonset style hut. And then you cover those hoops with floating row cover fabric that lets light in but keeps out the cold. And because it lets light through, you can leave your plants covered most of the time, and you can take the covers off and just pull them back out of the way on very warm days so it doesn't get too warm inside under the covers. Because if it gets too warm, then you can get insect and pest problems. You can get problems with the plants maturing too quickly and bolting, which is the term that we use when the plants start going to flower, which is a problem for winter crops like collards and kale and stuff like that. Once they start flowering, they don't taste as good and they stop producing as many leaves for your harvest. So you'll have to put the covers on and take them off when it's warm, put the covers on when it's freezing, take them off when it's warm. You can also use cloches, which are sort of tiny glass covers to cover individual plants, and it makes it kind of like a tiny greenhouse. Same thing, you can put the cloche on when it's cold, and if the cloche lets light through, you can leave the plants covered as long as it's not too warm outside and making it too hot inside the cloche. You can use jars turned upside down over small plants, or even plastic milk or soda bottles with the tops cut off as cloches. Other advice for covering plants, for vegetables in particular, during freezing weather, I usually keep some old sheets or lightweight blankets around, and I throw those over the plants temporarily if the freeze is only going to last 1 or 2 nights. Again, temporarily covering the plants is great, but you want to make sure that you uncover them so they can get light once the freeze passes. Temporarily covering plants with straw, pine needles, or tree leaves can also insulate them from the cold, too. After freezing weather passes, just make sure you remove those opaque covers or leaves or straw. Try to get all of that stuff, all those materials gathered up now so that you aren't scrambling at the last minute if there's a freeze. There's another alternative to all of this protecting, too. You could also choose to take your chances and see which plants survive freezing temperatures and which don't in your vegetable garden. And you could save seeds from the ones that do survive the cold in order to preserve the genetics of the strongest plants that have the ability to survive freezing temperatures without covers. Make notes in a journal or tie ribbons around the best plants so that you can remember to save seeds from them. And then you can develop plants that have genetics that can survive cold snaps so that you don't have to cover them as much. Sometimes it gets so cold that there's no crops that would be able to survive. But sometimes you get lucky and some things will make it. If you have strawberries going, they are sort of the exception to the rule for fertilizing in the winter. Strawberries really would like to be fertilized in the winter. If you're growing strawberries in the ground, I highly recommend that you do a soil test to find out what type of fertilizer you need to use for strawberries. If they're in a pot or in a raised bed, you can use Has to Grow fertilizer is a really good choice for them, and there'll be a link in the show notes to Has to Grow. Okay, now over to the herb garden. Late November is your last chance for planting cool season annual herbs like cilantro, parsley, dill, chamomile, feverfew, and calendula, and cutting celery. You can plant those either from seed or small plants. And I do know gardeners that continue planting those seeds through the whole winter and are often successful. So I'm being pretty strict with the deadline. Just if you plant new seeds and they come up and they're really little, sometimes they can get damaged by the cold if we get a really hard freeze. So I usually stop planting around December 1st, but I know a lot of gardeners that continue planting herbs from seed through the whole, really until January. This year, I'm thinking about growing fenugreek, which is an herb often used in Indian and Southeast Asian cooking. And I have some seeds for that, and I know they can be planted now. So I'm going to try that out. Just something a little different for me. And this is really, I think, your very last chance to put perennial herb plants in the ground. So the perennial herbs are the ones like sage, thyme, chives that live for several years. If you have them, plant them as soon as you can, but don't get any more. Moving on to annuals. November is a good time for planting cool season annuals as small plants or transplants. things like pansies, violas, snapdragons, and cyclamen. Ornamental cabbages and kale are really fun and kind of different, something interesting to add to the landscape or to a pot or a hanging basket when planted as small plants. Alyssum and sweet peas can be planted as seeds directly into the garden or as small transplants too. For wildflowers at this time of year, it's too late to plant from seed. Really, you could, but you're not super likely to be successful. If you've already got the seeds and you really want to plant them, you can. You also could keep them in your refrigerator in a sealed container and plant them in the spring instead. And I think that you may have better luck that way. However, you can sometimes find bluebonnets, lemon horse mint, gaillardia at the nurseries at this time of year as little transplants in 6-packs or in little 4-inch pots. So look for those. You can add wildflowers to your landscape that way. There's a company called Native American Seed, and they sell live roots of certain wildflowers and native grasses that you can plant at this time of the year. So look for those. And speaking of Native American Seed, they were one of the sponsors for our Central Texas Seed Savers fundraiser that we held at Greensleeves Nursery on November 1st. And I just want to thank everyone who came out. It was a great success. We raised a lot of money for Central Texas Seed Savers for us to continue doing our good work in the community of encouraging people to save seeds and share seeds with one another, preventing extinction through seed sharing. So thanks to all our sponsors, thanks to all the volunteers that were there, and those of you who came out to say hi to me at Greensleeves Nursery on November 1st. Okay, and then coming up on Monday, November 17th, I will be presenting about tree planting techniques at the Williamson County Master Gardeners monthly meeting, which starts at 6:30. So check that out, and you can get more information in the show notes. Okay, that wraps up today's episode. Don't forget to check the show notes for links to the tools and events that I mentioned in this episode. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with a fellow gardener. It really helps more Central Texans find the show. I'm Colleen Dieter with ATX Gardens, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the ATX Gardens podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please follow, rate, and share it with your fellow Central Texas gardeners. For show notes, tools, and to book a consultation, visit atxgardens.com. Happy gardening, and I'll see you next time.